An ordinary shopping trip at the supermarket turned into a memorable moment when an elderly woman told a black man to go back to Africa. What he said next not only silenced the room, but changed everything. The supermarket is bustling with the sounds of daily errands. Shoppers pushed carts through the aisles, some deep in thought, others chatting quietly. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon in a small Ohio neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other. But today, that daily rhythm will be broken in an unexpected way. Near the vegetable area, an older woman, perhaps in her 70s, stood adjusting her glasses. She seemed impatient, muttering as she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and carefully styled gray hair made her look nothing special. But what happened next was completely different. A tall black man, wearing a blue hoodie and casual jeans, approached the same counter to grab a nearby bag of oranges. His name is Daryl. He is calm, polite, and seems to blend naturally into the store's atmosphere. He was texting on his phone while balancing his grocery basket when it happened. The older woman turned around when she noticed Daryl's presence, and her expression changed dramatically. Not at all subtle, her eyes were narrowed and her lips were pursed. "People like you don't belong here," she said, loud enough for those around her to hear. Daryl stood still, his finger still hovering over the phone. When he looked up, she continued in a sharp and venomous voice. "Why don't you go back to Africa, where you came from?" The air seemed thick. Several nearby shoppers stopped walking, some exchanging uncomfortable glances, while others pretended not to hear. The rhythm of the store was interrupted, replaced by an awkward, uncomfortable silence. Daryl's first reaction was shock. His eyebrows furrowed, and for a moment, it looked like he was about to say something right away. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, his face expressionless, as if he was considering every possible reaction. The woman still stood there, her hands clutching the apples, her attitude unapologetic and determined. Tension permeated the air, and everyone around could feel it. A young mother hurriedly took her child away, while an older man, near the potato shelf, glanced nervously at Daryl, waiting to see what he would do. The silence that followed was heavier than any words, setting the scene for what was about to happen. For a moment, Daryl stood completely still, clutching the handle of the shopping cart. The world around him seemed to shrink. Every sound in the store was muffled, every face turned towards him. The weight of the woman's words remained like an unpleasant smell that no one could escape. The older woman did not back down. Her attitude was challenging, as if she didn't expect any rebuttal. She adjusted her cardigan with an annoyed look, her chin raised in a way that dared him to respond. A young employee who was stacking bananas a few feet away stood still, not knowing whether to intervene or stay out. A cashier stretched his neck to get a better look. The gathering crowd did not come closer, but did not leave either. They have become witnesses, whether they like it or not. Daryl glanced at the woman, his face calm, but his eyes thoughtful. 1,000 answers ran through his mind. He could get angry, scream, or walk away in a huff, but none of those options felt right. The pressure weighed on him like a burden. But instead of breaking down, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He shifted the basket to his other hand and stood up straight, his presence growing louder in the silence. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm, cutting through the awkward atmosphere. "Madam," he began in a measured tone, "do you actually realize what you just said?" His question was not accusatory, but reflective, as if he were giving her a chance to think about his words. But she seemed to have no interest in contemplation. "I said what I meant," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A young girl near the bread counter audibly exhaled, and the crowd's murmurs became louder. However, Daryl remained calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move closer. Instead, he let the silence linger, giving her words a chance to sink into the ears of everyone around him. "Okay?" he said finally, nodding slowly. His calmness has a special power, almost making others uneasy. "Let's talk about that since you mentioned it." The whole room held its breath, waiting for his answer. A storm is coming, but not the kind anyone expected. Daryl shifted his weight, placing the basket on the floor carefully. His calmness is like a magnetic force, pulling everyone closer, even those who pretend not to listen. He turned his gaze toward the older woman, not with anger, but with a kind of silent determination that made her manage uncomfortably. "You say I don't belong here," he began, his voice firm but determined. "But let me tell you about where I come from." His every word carried weight, spoken as if carefully selected. "My great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he said, pausing long enough for the words to sink in. "He was a hired laborer, working on land that didn't belong to him, breaking his back so his children could have a better life. His father was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, sold as property." Property? And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in? The woman's lips pursed tightly, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was completely captivated. A man near the dairy area, who was glancing at his phone, completely put it down. An elderly couple whispered to each other, but did not look away. "My grandfather," Daryl continued, his voice growing stronger, "fought in World War II, fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, only to treat him like trash when he returned. Can't sit at the same counter, can't drink from the same tap, but you still stay. Do you know why? Because you believe in the promise of this country, even when it doesn't believe in you." A silence enveloped the room. Even the buzzing sound of the refrigerator seemed smaller now. "And my parents," he continued, his voice softening but not losing any of its intensity, "they fought too, not with guns or fists, but by working every day, raising me to believe on kindness, respect, and hard work. My mother is a teacher. She spends her life helping children, not caring what they look like. My father is a mechanic, the type of person who will stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car breaks down." He let these words sink in before continuing, still looking straight at her. "So you're saying I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly, his voice now carrying a bit of sadness. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Perhaps more so, because my family has paid for it with blood, sweat, and tears." The older woman's face turned red, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the apples. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but stopped, her words stuck in her throat. Daryl took a step back, his attitude still unchanged. "I could leave," he said, now facing the entire crowd. "But what good would that do? Ignorance cannot be better." In silence, we all have to be better than this, better than words like that. The weight of the words still resonates, but the story doesn't end there. The crowd's reaction will say more than anything else. The silence that followed Daryl's words was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. The older woman's face was a mosaic of emotions: anger, shame, and something deeper, almost like shame. She looked around the crowd as if looking for an ally, but no one spoke. A middle-aged man, wearing a baseball cap, stepped forward. "He's right," the man said, breaking the silence. "We have to be better than this." His words seemed to break a spell. An older woman near the frozen goods section nodded. "My father also fought in that war," she said softly, her voice shaking. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The whispers began to grow louder. A young cashier, no more than 20 years old, called from her counter, I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with such grace. Thank you." The older woman was now clearly confused, clutching the cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had gone out. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean—" But then she stopped. Daryl turned to look at her, his expression softer now. "It's not about what you mean," he said softly, "but about how it's said. Words carry weight, and actions matter. More important." A man from the meat counter began to clap slowly, breaking the tension. Hesitant at first, but then the others joined in, the sound rising into something undeniable. People applauded, not only for Daryl's words, but also for his courage in facing hate with dignity. The older woman looked around one last time, her face pale, before quietly pushing the cart toward the exit. As she left, several people came to comfort Daryl. A woman put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Daryl smiled gently, picking up the basket. "Sometimes," he said, as if talking to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly dispersed, the tension in the air replaced by a sense of contemplation. Some people looked inspired, others became contemplative, but all seemed to have changed in some way. The moment is over, but the impact of Daryl's words is far from over. This is a lesson in the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. It teaches us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means speaking calmly, with conviction, and letting the truth speak for itself.